Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear and see me. I am truly honored to be here, one of the presenters, to spend the next few minutes talking to you about the physiological perspective on embodied racism and experiencing racialized trauma. I work with Robin and Skye in the Department of Kinesiology, and this has been an exceptional way to continue our work together outside of our immediate department. So to talk about racism from a physiological perspective, I think it's important for all of us to recognize the reach of racism as a stressor. So embodied racism within each individual poses a role as a stressor, and certainly as the target of racialized trauma and violence, this is an extreme stressor. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes to explain a model that was explained by Dr. Selye, an endocrinologist in the 1960s and 70s. His model of stress based on physiology and psychobiology called the general adaptation syndrome. And so this model states that when a person feels threatened, if their well-being is threatened because of a stressor, there's a 3-stage bodily response. And that first stage is alarm, second stage is resistance, and the third stage is exhaustion. So you can see in this diagram on the far left, prior to the encounter of a stressor, our internal environment is in a state of homeostasis. Homeostasis being a steady state within the body. Upon encountering a stressor, the body first initially reacts with a fight or flight response. This is the alarm stage. There are hormones released internally, such as cortisol and adrenaline, and these released into the bloodstream stimulate a series of responses that allow the person to meet the threat or danger. And so the body's resources are now mobilized and on alert. With the mobilization of these resources, many physiological functions can return to a somewhat normal state while the body is still focused on resisting the stressor. And so this is the resistance stage. This is a stage of great strength, great power, but also energetically very costly. One's outward appearance may seem normal, but their body remains on red alert when you look at the internal biomarkers. Now, if there's no relief, if there's no time to recover, and the stressor continues beyond the body's capacity, then one enters the final stage of exhaustion. And so resources have been used up, they're exhausted, and the individual becomes susceptible to illness, to disease, to possibly death. So the key element in this stress response that's missing from our modern day stress paradigm is recovery. While there are usually recovery times for life-threatening events, usually acute stress can lead to the alarm and resistance stage followed by recovery. But when you talk about things such as systemic racism, such as trauma and violence that has been generational, there is no recovery, there is no time to recover after the alarm and resistance stages. And these stressors can string themselves together, rendering a stress response that's turned on all the time and can lead to some long-term detriments in health. And so this reach is beyond just a time issue, even though we've got time here on the x-axis across the bottom. Time doesn't necessarily mean a person needs to be in their older years to experience the exhaustion stage. So for example, just locally at a high school a few months ago, a high school was getting together for an assembly. This was before we all left for quarantine, and students were talking about their experiences of racialized trauma, and a young 17-year-old Black female high school student spoke in front of her school about her experience of just simply encountering a police officer. Not necessarily interacting with the police officer, but just encountering. And that source of stress was enough to cause her to break down and experience a nervous breakdown right there on stage in front of her peers, just to talk about the experience of encountering a police officer because of the trauma that is associated with that symbol. So this is a young person who's experiencing symptoms of exhaustion from a chronic stressor. Another example recently, you may have seen this in the news with a mother in San Jose taking her infant in a store. There was an altercation about social distancing, and a white woman deliberately turned and coughed on her 1-year-old infant. And that woman is actually a teacher, no less. So you can imagine the alarm that would occur in a mother who is fearful of the safety of her child in such an environment. The connection between a mother and her infant is even more complicated and meaningful. Whatever hormones that are released in her bloodstream during the alarm and resistance stages, these are frequently passed on through breast milk to the infant. And so you can imagine these physiological manifestations happening in someone who is even too young to emotionally process what's going on. So the stressor of racism extends a reach beyond just time in terms of age. It permeates all of time. And so when we talk about the various manifestations of stress on a physical body, we can use a term called allostatic load, based on the word allostasis, which is the process of trying to re-achieve stability or achieve homeostasis through physiological or behavioral change. So allostatic load refers to the collective physiological burden or the wear and tear imposed on a person by chronic stress. And it can look like many different things. Allostatic load in excess can lead to immune suppression, so a person is susceptible to disease, can lead to cardiovascular disease, most commonly incidents like heart attack, stroke, and the silent killer of hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Metabolic disruptions, most prominently type 2 diabetes, reproductive distress, digestive tract distress, including ulcers and the inability to absorb nutrients properly, bone disorders, including osteoporosis and perhaps stunted growth, and then in total, accelerated aging. So this accelerated aging again begins very early in the lifespan, and researchers published an article in 2016, Geronimus and co-authors. They looked at physiological parameters that collectively speak to this allostatic load. They examined over 22,000 adults across the United States of all races of ages 18 to 65. And they quantified allostatic load parameters, not unlike this list that you see in front of you, based on physicians' visits and blood work results. And they scored allostatic load on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being extremely high. And they found that an allostatic load score of about 4 was the threshold after which early mortality and morbidity started to occur. And so they plotted their allostatic load predictions on an age scale from age 18 to 65 and categorize them by race and by gender. So this article here, I've just taken this one diagram, this one figure to illustrate their main finding, which is that the stress inherent in living in a race-conscious society that stigmatizes and disadvantages Blacks may cause disproportionate physiological deterioration such that a Black individual may show the morbidity, which is illness, and mortality, which is death, typical of a white individual who is significantly older. And so on this graph here, from age 18 to 65 across the bottom, you can see there's a predicted probability of an individual having an allostatic load of 4 or higher. And again, 4 was that threshold after which early morbidity and mortality became prominent. The highest line, which is the open circles, is representing Black women. The closed circles represents Black men. That's the second line from the top. And then open squares represents white women, and closed squares represents white men. And you can see across the adult lifespan, Black women experience the highest allostatic load, which is that collective wear and tear on the body due to chronic stress. And to highlight the point at the top, if you just look at this orange line that's appearing across the middle, a 30-year-old Black woman experiences an allostatic load that is similar to a 37-year-old white person. And a 40-year-old Black woman may experience an allostatic load similar to a 50-year-old white man or woman. And then a 50-year-old Black woman may experience allostatic load that's comparable to someone in their mid-60s. So we're talking about the physiological effect of systemic racism and racialized trauma and violence, which is a part of society. This is not an acute stress. This is not something that just comes up now and then when it's caught on video. This is a part of society. And so when we think about how to recover from this type of stressor, and again, that first graph, you saw that without recovery, the last stage is exhaustion. When the society is the source of the trauma, we have to rephrase our question. The question about recovery is not about how to return to homeostasis, right? That would presume that society is productive and equitable and provides a safe place for all people. But rather, the question should be, how does one mitigate the allostatic load imposed by systemic racism in order to successfully navigate the struggle and still find joy? How does one recover in order to thrive in the face of adversity? Like a soldier who's still in battle, like a mother who fears for the safety of her child on a daily basis. It's not about returning to homeostasis. It's about thriving and living in a system where the society is the source of the trauma. Hopefully, I don't have the answer to this, but hopefully Shauna and Zara can give us some insight on how to tackle this question. And one thing I can offer is that our emotional response and our physical response are two things that are actually connected through dual pathways. So this is a simplified illustration of a dual pathway theory posed by Joseph Ledoux. And it describes the fact that our emotional responses, such as fear, anger, anxiety, and panic, these are things that we feel emotionally, can lead to, so you follow the arrow across the top, can lead to physical responses of a rapid breathing, a high heart rate, muscle tension, and maybe even trembling. And this is a normal physiological response to make sure that we get ourselves out of the way of danger, right? We need to mobilize and remove ourselves from the stressor that's causing these emotional responses. But at the same time, internally, we have a feedback system where our brain can sense that we are breathing rapidly, that our heart rate is elevated, our muscles are tense and perhaps trembling. And that physical response, in fact, turns back and it elevates the emotional response. This is a vicious cycle. Now, when we can't remove the stressor, and that stressor is the initial cause of the emotional response, one thing we can do is try to mitigate that feedback from the physical response. And so through a slow, deep exhale, through gentle movement, through muscle relaxation, perhaps we can attenuate the negative emotional responses by taking some time to attend to our physical response and to attenuate that second pathway from physical to emotional response. And so that's where I'll leave it, and my colleagues can pick up to lead us through this next piece on the gentle movement and relaxation. Thank you.